Good evening and a very warm welcome to this evening's lecture. So I'm Professor Louise Archer. I'm the Carl Mannheim Chair of Sociology of Education here at the IOE, and I'm really delighted to be chairing this event. And our speaker tonight is Annette Lareau, Professor of Sociology at the University of Pennsylvania and currently a visiting Leverhulme Professor at LSE. So as part of her Leverhulme Professorship, Annette is delivering a number of public lectures around the UK, and we're really honoured and pleased that she's allowed us to host one tonight. So as many of you will know, Annette's work focuses primarily on understanding social class inequalities within family life. Her many publications include two multiple award-winning books, Home Advantage, and a particular favourite on my own bookshelf, Unequal Childhoods, which reported on a decade-long project following 12 families and their parenting choices. She's particularly well known for her concepts like concerted cultivation, which she uses to describe middle-class parenting styles, showing how these practices produce a social advantage and disadvantage. This evening, Annette's going to be talking about how cultural knowledge can be consequential in mobility journeys, drawing on her latest publication, We Thought It Would Be Heaven, Refugees in an Unequal America, about how refugee families face hurdles and knots in the institutions they encounter as they seek upward mobility. And I think all of Annette's books and publications do what sociology does best, which is allow us not only to glance into the lives of others, but to understand how individual stories are produced in and through social structures, and to better understand the injustices that ensue, as well as informing us on how they might be overcome. So following my phone off. Following the next lecture, there's going to be time for Q&A, and then we've got a drinks and food reception, which I hope you can all stay for. So for now, as I say, Annette, we're really honoured that you're here to address us this evening, and we really look forward to hearing more about your work. And please, can I invite you to come and present your lecture? Thank you.
Well, many thanks to Louise Archer for that kind and generous introduction. And a special thanks to Fernanda Bowler, who coordinated this event, and Teresa Baker, and to all of you for coming. In her autobiography, My Beloved World, Justice Sonia Sotomayor, who is on the United States' highest legal court, the Supreme Court, describes the long journey she took traveling from the Bronx, which is a very low-income neighborhood in New York City, to the Supreme Court. This journey was long in part by the forms of cultural knowledge that she simply did not know, although she was extremely talented. She did not know about the existence of the Ivy League, which is a very it was actually a football league in the US, but it's a prestigious group of colleges, until her high school debating friend told her about it. She didn't know the difference between writing an essay based on memorization and analysis, despite graduating at the very top of her class in a Catholic high school. Or she didn't really even know what it meant to be a female professional. And so she applied to Harvard, and at those days it was still gender segregated, so Radcliffe was where she went. And there was an interview with an admissions officer in 1970. As she recounts, she says, "Inside the waiting room, when the inner door finally opened, I found myself face to face with a creature I had never encountered. A woman with a hairdo of sculpted silver and a perfectly tailored black dress, pearl necklace, earrings, beautiful little pumps. I followed her into her office and was stunned again by what met my eyes. I had never seen an oriental rug, and I had never seen a white couch. To be honest, I had probably never seen a couch that wasn't covered in plastic." So this sense of bewilderment that she experienced immediately translated into a feeling of self-exclusion. The interview may have been the shortest of my life. The flow of words that always came to me naturally just dried up. When I found myself back in the waiting room, the numbness dissolved into a suffocating panic. I don't belong here. For the first and so far last time of my life, I fled. And then rather waiting for the student guide reception, I told the reception, I'm sorry, I have to leave. Returning home to the Bronx, my mother looked up, what's wrong? You were supposed to be gone for a couple of days. And I said, Mammy, I don't belong there. So despite being admitted, Sotomayor crossed Radcliffe off her list. A friend from high school debate encouraged her to apply to Princeton, and when she went there, importantly, her friend was a cultural guide through a bewildering thicket. So youth who grow up in middle-class homes with middle-class relatives and middle-class family friends are routinely exposed to little and large forms of cultural knowledge, which can be very helpful in success for college and a professional career. For youth who grow up in a working-class home, that same knowledge is often hidden from view. And in sociological research, we have many wonderful studies, but often we're focused especially on economic factors, which to be sure are very important. I myself am studying wealth inequality right now, with the wealthy families. But there's often, I think, not enough attention to cultural knowledge. And when there is, it's often looking at cultural taste, for example, and consumption. But I'm particularly interested in how cultural knowledge shapes people's ability to navigate key institutions. So in my comments this afternoon, I want to focus our attention on these different forms of cultural knowledge. And I will describe how social class casts a long shadow over lives of people. And using a recent book with Blair Sackett, We Thought It Would Be Heaven, I show how requisite cultural knowledge creates barriers for recent immigrants in gaining access to legally authorized services. And then drawing on studies of the upwardly mobile, I try to seek to remind us that it's really not the intrinsic value of the cultural knowledge, but it's really how the knowledge helps us comply with the rules of the game, or what Pierre Bourdieu would have called fields. And so I'm going to draw on some different studies I've done of the upwardly mobile, including of young adults and older adults. So I'm really not going to talk much about methodology here, though of course I'd be happy to do so on the question and answer. But I just want to note that the names are pseudonyms and the colleges are not the actual colleges that people attended, but they're sister colleges. Okay. So just to provide a little bit of context, of course, we live in a world of growing inequality. In the US, there's very high level of inequality and there's quite a lot of poverty. And even though I know in the UK, people tell me the social safety net has been thinning, there's still more of a social safety nest here in the UK than there is in the US. In addition, we know that because, especially in the post-World War II period, there's a decline of good jobs. We have a lot of very low wage jobs, minimum wage jobs. The US has very high college debt, even higher than the UK. And we also have issues of, drug addiction, opioid, issues of safety, particularly in the city, and this sort of thinning infrastructure. And so this is the broader context. There's quite a lot of research showing that parent social class has a large and very powerful impact on kids' life chances, particularly on your likelihood of graduating from college within 6 years. And so about 2/3 of young people whose parents have at least one parent with a bachelor's degree graduate, but only 21% of people who are first-generation college students and low income. And so this issue of cultural mechanisms, I think, is really important, and that's what I want to focus on today. And especially how people navigate these rituals of daily life. Now, we have had sort of what I would call a cultural term. We have a lot of books in the US looking at cultural issues. Tony Jack and the Privileged Poor talks about the resources kids come to school. I have a lot of admiration for the book. The book that comes closest to my work today is Trapped in a Maze, an excellent book by Leslie Paik. And she's looking at the barriers people face when they're trying to get services for kids who are having trouble in the courts and also healthcare, while my work is a little bit more looked at education and upward mobility. So to preview my argument, I want to talk about how culture matters in different crucial forms of daily life. And first, I'm going to talk about a couple of young people. I did a longitudinal study. I started when these kids are 10. These kids are now 40, if I was following them, but I'm not. And though I do go by and see some of them at the holiday time. And you can just see really different. I'm going to talk especially about two African-American young women, one from a middle-class home and one from a poor home, and they just had very different life paths. So they both had hiccups. It wasn't like there was always smooth sailing, but they navigated them differently. Then I want to tell you about this book, We Thought It Would Be Heaven, and the refugees accessing services, and the hurdles, knots, and reverberations they faced. And then I want to talk about the working class kids who are upwardly mobile, to try to talk about the importance of seeing cultural knowledge within the rules of the game. Okay, trying to get this going here. Okay, so Unequal Childhoods, which is arguably the book I'm most well known for, is a study that was a study of kids when they were 10 years old. It had classroom observation and then in-depth interviews with parents in 88 families for a total of 137 interviews. And in there was also a longitudinal, there's this gardening concept that middle-class parents see kids as a project, and they're talking to them. They're doing fractions when they do baking. They're traveling. They're doing geography. It's like 24 hours a day. Let's develop these kids' educational skills. While working-class parents love their kids very much, and they want them to grow and thrive, and they provide very scarce resources to take care of them, to get them clothed and cared for, but they presume that children will spontaneously grow and thrive, and they see adulthood as looming as being with a lot of great difficulty. They want to protect their children and give their kids time to play. And so there was a follow-up study when the kids were 19 or 20. If they'd gone to college, it would have been at the end of the first year of college, though most did not go to college. And then again, when they were 29 or 30, by then, as I explain in sort of gory detail in the book, some of the families had a varying response to the book. Some were fine with it or happy with it. Other people had their feelings hurt. So I lost contact with some of the families in the book, which turns out to be pretty typical in this kind of research. You notice in the 7-Up, 42-Up book, he kept losing people as he went along, as they got older. And I do continue to have contact with some of the families. Every year I go by at holiday and I provide, gifts for them and their kids. So here's my definition of social class. It's what I would call a materialist, non-Marxist definition of class that looks at people's education and occupational experiences. And I'm particularly indebted to Bourdieu and the concept of cultural capital. And here I'm seeing culture as a resource which actually can yield profits, and is subject to monopolization and can be transmitted. So notice we have computers coming in, we have very different landscape, and yet middle-class parents often are dominating schooling and their kids are doing well in schooling, even though the rules of the game keeps changing every decade, certainly in elementary school and colleges, but we have a continuous pattern of class advantage, which tends to continue. Though there is some significant upward mobility and downward mobility, certainly in American society. So as kids, young people in the transition to adulthood move to college, they must instantly navigate many institutions. They have to decide where to apply. They have to work with the advising office in the United States. They have to decide on a major. They have to meet with the major requirements. Often they have to borrow money for college. They have to navigate the labor market, and they have to work on getting key services from institutions. More importantly, things often do not go smoothly. People fall behind in a class. They have learning difficulties. They have an emergency in this semester. They have a car accident, which I'll tell you about in a second. They don't know how to study, especially first-generation college students. Their financial aid application is incomplete. We had a refugee family where the kid went to college, remarkably, was doing well in college, and the whole thing almost came crashing down over one signature on a financial aid form. So often people can be arrested. So there are these hurdles that we all have in life, middle-class people have, we all have them. And these hurdles can create challenges which then people have to navigate. And each institution has different rules of the game. So this is 8 of the 12 kids from unequal childhoods. The blue are the middle class young people. And then there are working class and poor kids at the bottom. You'll notice that overall, not entirely, but overall, the middle-class young people graduated from college. They had kids later in life. Their kids were 7 to 10, while the working class and poor kids, the kids were more like 20. There was one young woman, Melanie Hanlon, who had a learning disability. Her mother just had 2 years of community college. Her mother didn't actually have a college degree. And she was admitted to a 4-year college, but didn't go, and ended up doing hair and later got married and had a child. The working class and poor kids, in the book I combine the working class and poor kids, though there were differences. There were food shortages in the poor homes, but not in the working class homes. The poor kids started working much earlier. They started working off 14, 15, 16. So by the time they were 20, they'd been working for years. Very few kids went to college. Some people had a little bit of a semester of community college, but generally did not have any sustained college education. Were mostly in working class jobs. So I was sort of stuck with the kids I had. If I'd had a different sample, I would have looked for people who were upwardly mobile or downwardly mobile, but in more or less, the young people followed national patterns in terms of how things turned out. So in these institutions, the rules are often unwritten. What you're supposed to do, how you navigate it, and of course, working class kids who don't have parents who did these things often are especially dependent on public institutions, which have eroding quality of services. So now I want to compare 2 young women. They're both African American. Stacy Marshall, whose mom had a master's degree and worked in STEM. Her dad had a sort of a low-level managerial job, also had a college degree. And Tara Caro, who grew up in a housing project living with her grandmother and lived on public assistance. And her mom later became someone who collected debt on credit card. So they both really wanted to go to college. And but it turned out their knowledge had a very important impact. So here's Stacy Marshall. She went on, when I met her at the end of her freshman year, she said, I'm going to be a pediatric neurosurgeon. That's what she told me at the end of her freshman year of college. And her mother also told me, as I'll explain in a minute, she got a C in biology, and her mother was like watching this going, like, uh-oh, and she thought it might really harm her medical path. In the end, she switched out of medicine, got a PhD, she got divorced, she's now engaged to be married again. She's today, as a 40-year-old, the mother of a 13-year-old. She works in a very elite educational setting. And throughout, when I interviewed her, she always said when her kid was 2, she took him to a natural history museum to see a dinosaur. When I asked her how her life was going when he was 2, she said, I think it's really, really great. I have a lot to be excited about. I'm going to expose him to an amazing place. I think it'll be amazing. I have a little anxiety about how everything will work out, but I'll figure it out. It's life. So when she was this freshman after the first year, she had gotten a few C's. And she said to me in retrospect later, I was just struggling. I was getting C's and C minuses, and I'm like, what medical school is going to take me with all these C's? I'm going to have to retake all this stuff. And her mother reported, her mother had a cousin who she felt her parents had squashed his desire by saying, you can't do that, you can't do it. And so she didn't want to say, this is not going to work out. But she was also, she knew what it took to apply to medical school, and she was very worried about the situation, but she held her counsel. She waited it out. So her daughter, during her freshman year, the mom said, it was 11 o'clock at night, Stacy was calling her, and she's like, she was trying to find a class to register for, and she's found a film class, and it fit at the right time. And so she's like, Mom, I might take this film class, you know. And the mom was like, look, you have to get out of calculus. You don't want your GPA to be too low. And she wanted to do a film class. And she's like, I don't know. And the mom says, look, you have an advisor. Go see your advisor in the morning, right? So her mom is teaching her how to navigate institutions. Sophomore year was better. She says, sophomore year was my breakout year. She was on a basketball scholarship. And I made all conference. It was good. I met a boy. I fell in love, all those fun things. I was doing well in school. I finally figured out I declared a major. I wanted to major. I put away the dream of being a pediatrician. I got over that. I had a new dream to get a PhD, and I followed through on that. So that was a really important year for me. So here, she had key forms of cultural knowledge. She knew what grades she needed to get in. She knew about the majors she needed to acquire this. And then later, after she graduated with her husband at the time, she moved to another part. She moved to Massachusetts. And on the day of her son's birthday, she had read about a professional association for people of color who had PhDs. And even though she did not know a single person, she drove an hour to go to this informal gathering. And through there, she met a network of people, which ultimately led to her job. So she was able to create and activate social ties, which then led to employment. In the US, about half of jobs are filled through informal social network. So overall, she's happy with how her life is going, and she used these networks, which helped her. Tara Carroll went to a public high school. She was only 35 minutes away from Stacy Marshall. And she was deeply religious family. Her grandmother answered the phone, God is good, hello. She says, I've always had a dream since I was 5 years old to become a nurse. There was a lady at church who wore a white outfit, and she thought, I really want to be a nurse. She went to a high school, and her test scores were only in the 50th percentile. And her GPA was slightly higher. She applied to 7 colleges. But she applied to colleges where the median test score, in the US we have something called the SAT, which is crucial for getting into colleges. She applied to a school where the SAT scores were 200 or 300 points higher than her own SAT score. And she was rejected everywhere, to every college. So she didn't have the cultural knowledge of what's a good fit for, and that's sort of an individualized experience. She and her mother were both deeply hurt by this experience, and the mother was very eager for her to succeed. So out of desperation, she went to a community college, still eager to be a nurse, and her first class was anatomy. She said anatomy and physiology. She said, I was going through some personal things, and I really didn't know about academic policies like withdrawing or dropping a course. And I was a really shy student and afraid to ask questions and stuff like that. So instead of me seeking counseling or advising, I just stopped going to the course. And as a result, I received an F on my transcript. And that's on my transcript, and it's always going to be there. It's never going to go away. So in the end, so this is a form of informal cultural knowledge. What do you do if you're having a problem in the course? Go to office hours, but also withdraw. It took her 7 years to get an AA degree, during which time she accumulated $12,000 in loans. And then she was admitted to a for-profit program for nursing where the tuition was $34,000 a year. And then she just had a piece of bad luck. She was driving to school, and a young woman had just gotten her license 2 days before, crossed traffic and hit the car and totaled the car. And she had grown up in an extended family where people were very warm and generous, so she expected the college professors to be similarly warm and sympathetic. And she was shocked when they treated her in a more institutional manner. So she said some of the people weren't very receptive. Their disposition just seemed so mean. And I felt that they weren't very sympathetic or empathetic. I felt they were treated like a business. Even one of my professors at the time of the car accident, I was worrying about school. And I called the teacher and I told her it was a car accident. She said, oh, well, you can come back and just make sure you have all the materials for the next lecture. And I was like, okay. I said I was in a car accident. You didn't say, were you okay? You just said this. Then in addition, the fact her grades were right around the 75th percentile. And to stay in the program, you had to clear 75%. And she was getting 73.9. And she was shy, and so she didn't know who to contact. And she didn't feel like she had grades or slips. She didn't really feel like telling anybody. And so then she was dismissed from the program. And there was this one professor she liked, and she reached out to her, but she ended up not getting back to me and took a leave of absence because she was pregnant. And so then 6 weeks after her termination, she wrote a letter to the dean's office. And by then, there were differences. I mean, by then, the semester started. And when she talked to people in the dean's office, Tara said, they asked me, why did you wait so long to write the letter? Because she was dismissed in December, and she sent the letter 6 weeks later. And I was telling her I went through a lot. I was just going through a lot, and I wasn't mentally prepared. I didn't want to write a letter or come back if I wasn't focused because I thought it was a recipe for disaster. So I did when I was mentally prepared. And when I was ready and explained that to her, she recommended I write a letter to the dean, and I received a letter from the dean, and she rejected my request. Implicitly, the educator was raising the question of why didn't she write earlier? And it's possible that if she'd written earlier in December, it might have been looked on more favorably than after the semester was already 2 weeks in going. So this issue of timing and knowing what matters, and then we found class differences in educational, both of them were in college, both of them were very ambitious, trying to be successful, but how to manage these little hurdles that were coming up and the resources they had at their advantage was different by class. Judith Levine, Temple shows that college really makes a difference in terms of career services and career advice, but there are some things where the colleges do not provide systematically this information. Only 1% of refugees worldwide are resettled to new countries. So they are win the lottery in the sense that they are very lucky to be able, and when they come to the US, they're given 90 days of support, and somebody meets them at the airport, and they provide valuable social services. In this book that we just published, we show how institutions matter and impede people from getting access to legally authorized services. Now, mind you, there are many different institutions, and all of them have different rules. The United States is a decentralized system. We have 50 states. States have different rules on unemployment, on food assistance, on housing, on Medicaid. And so even if you learn the rules of the game, it's not like the NHS, which once you learn it wherever you are in England, it's still more or less the same as I understand it, but it's highly local. So this is a study of 44 refugee families. Blair did all the research. She speaks Swahili. She's a young white middle-class woman. We did have 3 black research assistants from Kenya, and they also did the interviews. And surprisingly, we didn't find a great deal of difference in how they talked about race in the interviews, but the refugees did talk more about corporal punishment, complaining about the restrictions in the U.S. on corporal punishment, and also the lack of modesty in how women dressed in the U.S., which they did not tend to share with her. Then there were 5 families where she did observations, usually once a week, for about 9 months to a year and a half. This book, Listening to People, which is a deeply practical guide to doing interviews and observation, talks about the need for research to be emergent, where you sort of really don't know what you're doing and you find your way as you go along. So all organizations have hurdles. They have these routine rules and requirements to make appointments, to talk to people, to apply for preschool, free preschool, and so forth. And they're intended, historically, there's very strong evidence of issues of racism and deservedness and so forth. But they create complexity. And Charles Perrow in the US taught us that complexity increases error. So here's Malu and Mari, who Malu didn't have a leg right below his hip, and he was on crutches. It's very hard to find housing in the U.S. in Philadelphia that doesn't have steps in Philadelphia. So they actually lived in a 2-story apartment that was also up several steps. They had 18-month-old twins and a 4-year-old. They had 8 children, so just navigating all the stairs was quite a hurdle. He got Social Security for his payment, which impeded him from working. And he very much wanted to work, but he was not permitted to work. And so one day they arrive in the summer. Blair starts visiting them in the summer. It's a cold January morning when Nevin, a caseworker from India, South Asian, shows up with a Swahili translator on the phone. And he was there to enroll their daughter in a preschool program. They spoke Swahili at home. The preschool program could have been very helpful in helping develop her English and pre-literacy skills before kindergarten. So Nevin showed him, I had to fill out this form, but I need him telling Blair he needed documentation of their residence. And the documentation they had provided was inadequate. And so there were many requirements for Head Start. You have to show vaccination records. You have to show physical pay stubs, even in this day and age. You have to show medical records. You have to show dental records to go to a free child care program. And so Nevin was there to help to get all the paperwork involved. So Nevin asked him for paperwork, and Malu takes the crutches, starts hopping up the chairs to come back. And he comes back with a flyer that's an advertisements delivered to every household. He doesn't speak English. And he gives it to Nevin. And Nevin says, that won't work. It has to have your name on it. So then Blair explains in Swahili and the translator, and then he says, okay, so then he goes back up the stairs again. He comes down, and he has an electric bill with his wife's name on it, which qualified. And while he's gone, Nevin is complaining. He says it can take organizations a long time to give them some of the paperwork, in a month or so per every organization, and many organizations are involved to certify somebody for free childcare. So he hops up and down. In the end, they have it, but then it turns out that the local preschool was filled because it filled in September. So he suggested one that was over a mile away. But on a bumpy Philadelphia street with 2 18-month-old twins and a 4-year-old on crutches, it was very difficult for him to get there. And so he says, we want her to go to preschool. And he said, can you come back and show me the way? But Nevin did not return, and she did not return to preschool until the fall. So all that entire year ended up being lost with her not being in preschool. So sometimes there are these knots or snags in the process. And when that happens, more cultural knowledge is required to resolve it. So the Ngoma family, they had some education, unusual, in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And they arrived after many years in a refugee camp. They were in Tanzania for 19 years. And when they arrived with their 5 children, unusually they were greeted by a faith-based group of volunteers. There were 40 different volunteers, most of whom were almost all middle class, most of whom were white, some were Kenyan and black, and they were there to help the family. So they divided up. One person did tutoring, one person drove people to football, one person taught them how to use the ATM with their PIN, and they were providing very valuable institutional knowledge to this family. Many of the middle-class people had never been on food assistance, so they were surprised by the complex nature of the process. Because of the emphasis on deservedness and the worry about fraud, in the United States, every 6 months you have to reapply for food assistance, commonly called food stamps, although it's formally called SNAP. So a large envelope arrives in the mail, and you must fill this out. And if you don't, even if nothing has ever changed, and if you don't, then you can be cut off, which is what happened to Joseph and Georgette. So they said the form never arrived. Joseph would keep a big pile of all the flyers and junk mail, everything that came. He would give it to the volunteer, and there was no form. So then, once they were cut off, there was more cultural knowledge you needed to navigate it to get them reinstated. And so, once it was lost, Kathy filled out the form for them and sent it in. And this came when Georgette was out of work because of a health crisis. So then they had to appeal the decision. And she appealed it, and they went to the court, they told the judge, and the judge reinstated it. But then when they were filling it out, after they had had the court date, an employee was trying to be helpful. And the employee said, oh, you don't need to put in the birthdays. It will automatically populate it. But the employee was wrong because they had been terminated, and so the computer did not automatically populate it. And so the request was denied because of inaccurate paperwork and sent back to them again. In the end, it took 2 months. And as she said, it took 2 months right at the same time. And they were still trying to recover. So Joseph's, the food assistance was worth $1,400. And Joseph's income was $2,400. So not having food assistance for 2 months was more than 1 month's income. So it was a deeply consequential mistake. More importantly, Kathy was a cultural broker. She was a middle-class person. She was a former teacher. She was fluent in English. She was accustomed to American bureaucracy. But even she could not forestall this knot. And the system had too many opportunities to go wrong. So there are complex rules for immigrants, for everybody, but immigrants come and they have to do all the institutions all at once. And this is relevant to all of us. All of us have hiccups, sometimes with our insurance or our health care or many different things. And often it takes cultural knowledge to resolve it. All right, so then briefly, I want to just talk a little bit about this issue. This is not intrinsically valuable cultural knowledge, and that we want to keep our eye on this issue. And one way I've done a number of different studies about upwardly mobile. This study with Heather Curl was of adults that had 30 adults, 20 whites and 10 African-American families. They always had to have 2 degrees, not just a bachelor's, but like a lawyer or a doctor, more than just a social worker or a teacher. And the articles about the conflict they had with their families. But in the course of this, I interviewed Nick Nevins, who was a doctor and endocrinologist. And he got into a very prestigious Ivy League school. And he felt like an outsider there. He said, I wasn't going out to eat, I wasn't going to the bar, buying expensive clothing. There's one conversation I remember my roommate and I were sitting there, and this girl who lived on the hall had just come back from a shopping spree. And we were like, and she bought herself a leather jacket. And we're like, how can you do that? And she said, well, I had a summer job. And I was like, and she was like, and if you guys had worked, you would have money too. And I'm like, yeah, we've both been working, but our money went to the tuition. And so this sort of cavalier statement made him a little angry. He was focused on his independence and his skills that he had. But he said, my upbringing's been a great strength because I understand the value of the dollar. I mean, I think in many respects there's a groundedness, I think, to some of the things I've learned from my background. And I think that's been a strength for me. And so he was appalled at the helplessness and dependence he witnessed among many elite undergraduates. A lawyer had a similar view. At first a businessman, this very deeply religious family, and he stressed his sense of morality, which guided him in the business world, which was often fraught. And he said that he was well grounded, and he said that really stayed with him his whole life, despite there were some things that he did not know. And then finally, a lawyer said, our clients he's a lawyer in a public defender's office. You know, the people we get are from inner city, parts of the city, grew up in single parent home with a low income housing. I think it's easier for me to empathize with people and interact with people on a social basis from different backgrounds because of my experience. I'm not intimidated to go into a rough part of the city. And I find common ground with most people. So this is a people profession, and making people feel comfortable is very important. He also noted that some of our clients, they'll say, congratulations, brother, we see that you made it, we're proud of you. So this groundedness, easier to empathize, special skills. And in our upwardly mobile college students we interviewed, I interviewed with Sherelle Ferguson, an article in a journal in America. They were just outraged by the things that upper and middle class kids didn't know. Like one woman described sitting there in the library doing her budget and writing down shampoo. And this guy, her friend, said, well, what are you doing? She said, I'm doing a budget. He's like, what's that? And so she just felt that they would book their own plane tickets. They filled out financial aid forms, which were extremely complex, do their laundry. And a lot of these working class kids were talking about the things that they knew, and other kids just did not know them. So today I've talked a little bit about how class can shape some forms of cultural knowledge, and how in some instances this cultural knowledge can facilitate or impede mobility. I've looked at higher education institutions, and the many different aspects of college, which are often, I think, not sufficiently appreciated. The housing office, a roommate problem, an advising problem, falling behind in a class, all these different issues. How do you get a letter recommendation? Interviewed many upwardly mobile first-gen kids who had lots of the highest grade you could get, did not know how to get a letter recommendation. You cannot apply to graduate school in the United States without a letter recommendation. And so you need to be able to go to office hours, figure out how to ask people, better in person than on email. Again, this sort of informal rules of the game. in the refugees and immigrants getting authorization and services that are legally authorized, but there are many barriers to get. We've had a lot of research on this in the welfare and people getting social welfare. And sometimes the employees are hostile and mean, but also sometimes just routine things create errors. And then the point of not seeing, I met many, I spent a lot of time studying families and schools and school relationships. And there was a lot of emphasis on the intrinsic benefit of middle-class childbearing and not looking at the drawbacks of middle-class childbearing and some of the advantages of sometimes the working-class childbearing. And I think we need to look more directly at the structure, the rules of the game, and the ways in which cultural knowledge yields profit for some people in certain situations and can be of tremendous advantage. There are and so this really makes us look a little bit more deeply at the gatekeepers for a variety of institutions. There are certainly policy recommendations, programs for first-gen students, for refugees, for immigrants. Mentorship can be invaluable. Fostering cross-class friendships among young people in college can be invaluable in gaining access to informal networks and jobs. Giving free advice. I have a couple of students I meet with who are first gen, and I'm not really an expert on workplaces, but I'm like, go to the happy hour, talk to people. I have good enough advice. And sometimes even faculty, although we're not trained for that, can provide good enough advice to be helpful to first gen people who are navigating these institutions. And so having cultural brokers, not simply the children of these people, but having educators and professionals provide cultural brokering can be extremely helpful as we look more deeply into class, cultural knowledge, and mobility, and the way in which cultural brokers can provide crucial aid at key moments in mobility journeys. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Annette. That was absolutely fantastic. So I really love the way that you're showing how institutions matter. And it's not just about being efficient or inefficient, but how they have these built-in inequalities and how they're so difficult to navigate. I think the notions of the knots and the reverberations is really, really productive. I think I particularly liked as well about how you're showing that this isn't neutral, the knowledge in question doesn't in itself have a value, but it's the context that it works in. It matters which bodies are embodying the knowledge, and then what we need to do to help resolve those inequalities. And I think in particular, it really makes me think about that notion from the title, showing the limitations of the American dream, that it's not just about wanting it, it's not just about grit and resilience, but there are deep baked in injustices in the system. But I think it's also fantastic that you've got messages for policy around what could be done and how we need to rethink institutions and how we support people. And I just want everyone to join me in thanking Annette so much for such a fascinating, rich and engaging lecture. So thank you, Annette.